The great house stands in majestic isolation under the brightness of a full moon, but none who live there know that on this night, the full moon will mean something it has never meant before. It is the sign of a new and terrifying evil that prowls the woods of the Collins estate in search of a victim and initiating even more terror at Collinwood. Welcome to episode 14 of Terror at Collinwood. I am your hostess, Danielle S. Olivera Galerter, aka Penny Dreadful. And before we dive in today, I have some fun news for you. As many of you know, I am also a television horror movie hostess. I hosted the show Shilling Shockers on local television in haunted New England for 10 years. And although the show ended a while back, I do an annual Halloween special, which is posted directly to the Shilling Shockers Vimeo channel. And this year's Halloween special will feature the film Night Tide, directed by Curtis Harrington and starring a very young Dennis Hopper, and it will also feature the short film A Poem of Poe as part of the Theatre Fantastique series directed by Ansel Farage. And of course, you heard Ansel in episode 5 of this podcast. Ansel is a huge Dark Shadows fan and a very talented filmmaker and a big monster kid. And the film features Christopher Pennock, who Dark Shadows fans will of course know from his many roles on DS. So you can find that on the Shilling Shockers Vimeo channel. I'll post a link to that. That'll be coming out at the end of October 2021, and it'll be archived there since we're in the midst of the spooky season. Halloween is upon us. There's also lots of great Dark Shadows merchandise and great Dark Shadows stuff out there right now. I'm just going to mention a few of them here right now. Paperback Classics is releasing audio versions of the classic Dan Marilyn Ross Dark Shadows novels, and you can find those at paperbackclassics.com, and they are read by the one and only Catherine Lee Scott. So you can listen to all of your favorite Ross novels now read by Catherine Lee Scott. They have CDs and they have the digital versions. I actually just ordered Barnabas Collins versus the Warlock. It just came in the mail, so I'm excited to listen to that during my next drive. Also, speaking about the Dan Ross novels, Hermes Press is releasing all of the Ross novels. They are reprinting them all. I got an email recently informing me that Barnabas Quentin and the Witch's Curse and Barnabas Quentin and the Crystal Coffin are available at Hermes Press website, hermes-press.myshopify.com. Hermes Press also has released collections of the Gold Key Dark Shadows comics, the Dark Shadows Story Digest, the Dark Shadows newspaper strips. They're doing an amazing job. In addition to all of that, the Jonathan Frid documentary is now available. You can get it at Apple TV. You can get it on Blu-ray, DVD through Amazon. I am eagerly awaiting my copy from Amazon. It should be in any day now, so I look forward to watching that. And last but not least, I received a message from writer and longtime Dark Shadows fan Rod Labby, who has informed me that he has a major interview with Lara Parker, which is appearing in the new issue of Retro Fan Magazine. Retro Fan Magazine is a really cool magazine. Lara is on the cover. The vampire Angelique is right on the cover of the magazine. Dark Shadows' Lara Parker comes alive in an exclusive interview, and it was Rod who conducted that interview, so make sure you check that out. Retro Fan Magazine number 17. That issue of Retro Fan Magazine, number 17, also features articles about Mad Monster Party, the Aurora Monster model kits, and has a chat with James Bama, the painter of the Aurora model kits, so lots of cool stuff in there. In addition, make sure to check out the most recent issue of Darkside Magazine out of the UK, issue number 219. There's a full-length article about Dark Shadows in that issue, too, and it's a painted cover with Barnabas and Angelique, so lots of cool stuff going on. And now, let's get on with the show. Welcome to Terror at Collinwood. I am really excited to bring you my guest today. It is Scribe Award winner Stephen D. Sullivan, who's a prolific game designer, author, artist, and radio host. He's best known for his work on Dungeons and Dragons for TSR and was one of the prime creators of Chill, a really cool tabletop horror role-playing game. I used to have it. Stephen's books include Daikaiju Attack and novelizations of White Zombie and Manos, The Hands of Fate. He's the creator and writer of Dr. Cushing's Chamber of Horrors and Frost Harrow, a modern Gothic horror series which could be described as Dark Shadows meets Stephen King. Stephen's website can be found at stephendsullivan.com. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's really great to be here with an old Dark Shadows fan like myself.
Yeah, well, I'm so thrilled that you're here to talk Dark Shadows, and we've messaged a bit over on Facebook, and I've heard you, of course, on Monster Kid Radio, Derek M. Cook's wonderful podcast about classic monster movies, and I know you are an aficionado and a big Dark Shadows fan as well. So tell me about your introduction to Dark Shadows. How did you first get into Dark Shadows, Stephen?
I was a monster kid pretty much ever since I can remember. I know I probably started with dinosaurs, which a lot of monster kids, I think, probably did. When I was, I remember I was in the hospital for a long time when I was 5. And I remember getting dinosaurs for my birthday and being really thrilled with dinosaurs, even at 5. And somehow I segued from dinosaurs into things like Godzilla, Creature from the Black Lagoon, the Aurora model kits, and all monsters in general. So by the time I was, 6 or 7, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea was on. I was trying to sneak downstairs and watch that past my bedtime. And somewhere in there, as we moved from New Jersey to Massachusetts, I discovered Dark Shadows in a TV listing in the TV Guide in Boston. Wow. And it was not on at the 3 to 4 o'clock hour that it was supposed to be. It was on something like, my memory says it was 9 a.m., maybe 9:30. Mm-hmm. It was one of those really odd hours that was fortunately just after school started.
Now, was this in 68 or 67? Or?
I think it was 68. It was right at the start of the Quentin storyline and the Werewolf storyline that we're going to talk about, which was kind of perfect for me.
Yeah.
I spotted Dark Shadows. I think it may have said horror, but I think more likely it said melodrama. Mm-hmm. And I knew from my experience with searching through the TV Guide for things to watch, which is something all of us did back in the day. You got the TV Guide every week, and then you took a pen and you marked the stuff you wanted to watch. If you were a monster kid, you would find all the sci-fi stuff and all the horror stuff, and you would mark it. And I came across the Dark Shadows listing, and I don't think it may not have even said anything more than melodrama, but it was like, well, that sounds like it might be a horror thing. And it stuck in my head. And I'm not sure if I was homesick or if it was right around the holidays, because I looked up when these episodes happened, and it was right around the holiday period in that year, and managed to see one of them. And I believe the first one I saw is the one, it's either the one where the werewolf, you don't see the werewolf, but he kills the innkeeper, or it's the one, more likely it's the one where I think Liz is going through a bunch of other stuff, and it's not really super exciting stuff. But at the end, you get to see Chris Jennings' hand, and it's the hand of a werewolf. And I was like, oh my God, I have to watch this show. The werewolf, Wolfman, is probably my second favorite monster after the Creature from the Black Lagoon, not counting things like Godzilla, which are a completely different class. Mm-hmm. So that in itself was exciting to me. And it was like, I have to see this show again. And as I said, when I looked it up, it ends up that's right around the holidays was the stuff I was seeing. Mm-hmm. But basically, it became my mission in life to see every episode of this I could at that point, even if it meant staying from home from school when I was sick, when maybe I wasn't really sick, or I was just a little bit sick. It's like, how long can I keep this thermometer in my mouth before it'll go up above 98.6?
Yeah, it's such a bad time for them to air Dark Shadows at 9 a.m. because like a lot of kids were watching the show. I mean, the whole meme of I ran home from school to watch Dark Shadows, that saying. And my uncle was Valdemar was in New Bedford in the 60s, and the affiliate that was airing it there was airing it. I think he said it started
originally when he first started watching it in 67, I think it was 3:30, and then it moved to 4:00. So he would watch it after school. And but some of the other affiliates were airing it at strange times, that I've noticed, like what you described.
So there was a period there right at the start of the Quentin series where between holidays and being and or faking sick, I was a sick kid. So it wasn't like I need to fake sick a lot because I have bad lungs, still have bad lungs. So I would be home sometimes. And I managed to actually catch enough of the storyline to actually feel like I didn't miss any of the storyline. Mm-hmm. Right at that end where the Quentin storyline started, that overlaps the end of the Adams storyline. Yep. I managed to somehow see the Quentin parts and the werewolf parts and completely miss the Adam parts and the wrap-ups of the old storyline. So it seemed to me like I was seeing the whole show.
It's interesting when I had Dr. Jeff Thompson on here, he described the Dark Shadows storylines. It's structured more like a newspaper comic strip almost, where you have a story arc and then it kind of ends and the next one dovetails with it and then starts up this whole new storyline. And you came in right at the start of that. So that's an excellent kind of intro to the show. Now, did you continue to watch it all the way through the rest of it, or were you on and off after that?
It was once I found it, I watched every episode I could. And we got lucky because it must have been, maybe it was right at the start of the new year. They switched from the early morning hours into, it was either 3:30 or 4. I don't remember which. And if your uncle was watching it at 3:30, there were two stations that were showing it. There was the Providence ABC station and the Boston ABC station, which I think was channel 7 at the time, but it's now channel 5. And they showed it different hours. Slightly. They were half an hour apart. So right at near the start of the Quentin thing, suddenly we could watch it. And Providence was also showing it. So we could watch the same episode twice in one day.
That's awesome.
Which was awesome. But then it got even more awesome because somehow the earlier show, the 3:30 one, fell out of sync with the 4:00 one because they preempted it or something. So for most of the run, or most of the latter part of the run of Dark Shadows, we got to see the day before episode at 3:30 and then the new one at 4. And my brother, who's closest in age to me, Mark, and we were those kids that were jumping off the bus, running up the driveway to sit down at 3:30, which was about the time we got home, and we would then watch an hour of Dark Shadows. We were lucky in the fact that very early in the run, and for most of the run, we got to see, I think, every show twice.
That's so cool. An hour block of Dark Shadows. Usually
it was the most amazing thing.
That's great. And rewatching the one from the day before too. That's dedication. Like you watched it the day before and then you rewatch it the next day.
And then we rewatched it, and we did that every day until the series ended. The sad thing was when the series ended, we didn't get to see the end one twice because the 3:30 show then showed it again at 4 opposite the other one. So we only saw the last show once.
What was your reaction when it ended? Did you know that it was coming to an end, or?
I think we did. Because I think my memory is that it was all over the news, and it was kind of like, what, really?
Yeah.
You're going to end here?
Yeah. 1841 parallel time. It's
you aren't at least going to go back to our current crew and talk about them and how they lived happily ever after.
Yeah. It would have been nice to, I think, just do one more week where they're in the present day, where with the Collins family, we know.
I would have settled even for part of that show.
Yeah.
To suddenly go back and show that, Barnabas and all the rest of them were still doing fine in 1972.
Agreed. I think they were just at that point, from everything I've seen over the years, it's like everyone involved with the show was ready to move on. The show was becoming very expensive to produce, and ABC was, as Mary O'Leary mentioned when she was on the podcast, they asked Dan Curtis if he could bring the cost down to produce the show, and he said no. He was interested in going to make more movies, I think everyone was kind of burned out. The writers were kind of tapped at that point. Although one thing that the writers always would say, and Dan Curtis is like, we ran out of ideas. We didn't have any more ideas. We used every horror story in the book. And I definitely disagree with that. I think
Me too. They still had, I thought they still had plenty of stuff they could have done with Werewolf.
Mhm.
Obviously, people are so popular with Barnabas. I get that the actors were burned out, and that's why we started losing actors. I'm sure that's one of the reasons Catherine Lee Scott left when she did. It's just like the grind of doing what was essentially a live teleplay every day, 5 days a week. It must have just been insane. I mean, I've worked at TSR when it was a young company, worked at Pacesetter when it was a young company, and there were times where we were just in the office constantly working on D&D or working on Chill. I remember going and printing the D&D basic and expert sets where we were literally would get up before the sun came up, drive to the printing presses where they were creating the thing, putting the books together physically, proofing them as they came off before they were sent to be photographed and turned into plates and printed, and then going home after it was dark at night.
Yeah.
And there were times at Pacesetter where I remember my wife now, but my fiance then, had come to see me at the office, and she ended up sleeping on the couch. And we never went home because we were working all night on Chill. And those are, you really bond with people in those experiences. They're really important for friendships.
Sure.
But if it goes on too long, well, it's like the pandemic. It's like, okay, hey, great. I don't have to go into work for a while for some people, or I get to stay home, or my wife gets to be home with me.
Right.
And then after a little while, you're like, okay,
yeah,
do this for a long time. And now,
but you're right. You go through that experience, and there's a bond that's forged. And I'm glad you gave me a great segue with regard to the role playing background that you have in working on role playing games, creating role playing games. You have an extensive background, and a lot of fans of pop culture in general are role playing game fans, tabletop role playing, all of this kind of stuff. I have always wondered why there isn't a Dark Shadows role playing game. There seem to be role-playing games for everything that I've seen over the years. All of the big pop culture franchises, I guess. You see the Star Trek and the Doctor Who and the Star Wars and Universal Monsters and all of these. Even I've worked pretty extensively in the last 10 years or so on Masters of the Universe, on the He-Man and the Masters of the Universe from the 80s, and did a character guide and world compendium and a newspaper strip book and all these other things. And now there is from Fandom, the Fandom company, they're releasing a Masters of the Universe role-playing game, tabletop RPG. I think they're play testing it right now.
Right. There's a huge Masters of the Universe tabletop game coming out too that was, one of those, the buy-in starts at $100 or more.
Yes. So. Yeah. Yep. Come On is doing it. Oh, is it Come On? CMON. And then there's the Fields of Eternia, the European game as well. But Dark Shadows needs a role-playing game, I think. I think it would lend itself pretty well to a role-playing game. And I'm thinking along the lines of Ravenloft, the Dungeons and Dragons setting of Ravenloft, which was a Gothic horror template. And in many ways, it was similar to Dark Shadows in that they incorporated a lot of classic horror stories and characters and archetypes into their world and adapted them into Dungeons and Dragons. So it was this domain of dread, and each one of the Dark Lords is based on a classic literature character, And I would say Strahd, the character Strahd, actually pulls a lot directly from Barnabas Collins. There's the whole Josette aspect that's clearly inspired by Barnabas in that aspect. Why, Stephen, isn't there a Dark Shadows role-playing game? And why don't you make a Dark Shadows role-playing game? That's my I would love to see that.
The answer to the second one is that I'm interested, Dark Shadows people. If you want to talk to me, I will figure it out, and I have enough friends in the industry that we will somehow be able to do that. The historical answer would be, I think that horror role-playing games were not really super popular at the time that a lot of this stuff was going on. I remember that when Tracy Hickman created Ravenloft, like when he created Dragonlance, there was a serious kind of pushback in the company against even doing the idea. The executives of the company didn't think that this was a good idea. They didn't think people would like it. They didn't think horror would mix well with the kind of systems that Dungeons and Dragons supported and the way that people played it and stuff. But they're, there were enough of us in the company that supported Tracy's ideas, and one of them was Andrea Hayday, who also ended up working with us on Chill, who was one of our prime people working on Chill as well, that thought this was just a great idea, and that if we could meld that into the D&D setting, super. And obviously, as the years have gone on, there was one Ravenloft module, and now there's tons of Ravenloft stuff from this setting that at the time they didn't think would work. They're like, why aren't you concentrating on the official D&D settings? Why do you need a world where there's horror? Why? There were all these reasons not to do it. And I think in some sense, back in the early 80s, at the same time, the horror role-playing game had been, I wouldn't say completely wrapped up, but it had been largely, that niche had been filled by Call of Cthulhu, which continues to this day.
Yes.
I mean, before Call of Cthulhu came out, it was only like a bunch of us nutty readers that knew who H.P. Lovecraft was, knew what Cthulhu was, had a way of even pronouncing it.
Yeah.
And so that had taken one section of the market. And when we created Chill, in 1984, we were creating Chill to fill the segments of the horror market that Call of Cthulhu wasn't filling, which was the Gothic horror, Dark Shadows type of edge of the market. And that was what we were interested in. And if you look at the dozen or 2 dozen game modules we put out for that, you'll see that we were aiming for that corner of the market. That was part of what we were doing. Chill in its original form the company only lasted 2 years. And once the original Chill was off the market, the second edition of Chill became much more of a slasher game because it was the 80s, and they replaced our Raven, who was the narrator of the game, with some kind of a faceless killer. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was a big twist away from the Gothic horror style that we wanted the game to be into a 1980s horror style. And, there are things I love about horror in the 1980s. I love John Carpenter's work particularly, but a lot of it is just not as interesting to me as vampires and werewolves and that kind of stuff. And,
Yep.
We'd even done, at the end of the Chill run, we'd even done the creature feature where you could actually play the parts of the monsters, which was just a blast. Playing the envoys of the good save, just to back up a little, the characters in Chill belong to an organization called SAVE, which it stood for Societas Albae Viae Eternitata or something like that. It was, a Latin name, so we got the acronym. And it was basically the X-Files before there were the X-Files.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. Now, do you think that Dark Shadows would work as an RPG setting?
I think it potentially would work as an RPG setting. When we were at Pacesetter, one of the things that we did later on was we got a license from Elvira, and we did a book of Elvira-based role-playing settings where, we would have her voice and pictures of her and do a little intro in her voice, the way she would in her introductions, and then have a fairly straightforward Chill game. I would think that if original Chill had survived as a Gothic horror game, there's no reason to think that Dark Shadows would not have been a license that somebody might have pursued. Certainly it was something that those of us that were there at the time were interested in. And it's been a long time since I've seen Ravenloft, but it wouldn't, and I'd have to call him and ask him, but it wouldn't surprise me at all that was one of Tracy's influences as well. And clearly it was something Andrea knew about as well, and something I was very into, and, where others were in the company were probably more into Universal horror or Hammer horror, but clearly that potential was there. But once Chill shifted from a classic monsters game into an 80s game, it has never really gotten back to its roots.
Right.
And at the same time, the other monster games that sprang up at that time were things like Vampire the Masquerade, which was more of the kind of, for lack of a better thing, because I think they owe these guys royalties, it was more like the underworld settings.
Definitely, yeah.
It was a much different kind of setting. So I think in some sense, the Gothic horror moment in the 80s passed, and it's never really been regained. Although, with games like Horrified, which is based on the Universal monsters, it's possible that now would be a really good time to redo Dark Shadows games. And of course, we remember the ones that we had as a kid. I have the Whitman board game, which is a fun card placement game, and then the goofy spinner one where you spin and build your skeletons.
Yes, the Barnabas Collins board game. Yeah, I have both of those too. Those are really fun. But I'm thinking more along the lines of like a full-on tabletop, in-depth game with a thick rule book that has all the lore in it and the rules and beautiful illustrations by artists in that sort of Gothic style. I just think it would lend itself well to that. And with all of these independent companies that exist now, kickstarting their own RPGs, I really think that it could work if somebody actually got the license. I think the licensing does go through Dan Curtis Holdings with, Jim Pearson, I think handles all of that. And MPI puts out most of the Dark Shadows merchandise. But one of the things I really want to do with this podcast as I go through is explore ideas for other Dark Shadows merchandise. Like, for example, Mark Maddox did the artwork for that amazing lunchbox that MPI did. And I was really excited that they did that because that was something new. But the RPG, it hasn't ever existed for Dark Shadows, and I think that's kind of a shame because
it could really easily. It's definitely as a type of gaming that I think the original Chill, really could have handled well.
Yeah,
and I don't see any reason why you couldn't do it nowadays, either under an existing system that's fairly flexible, like D6 times D6, which is done by Lister Smith, which is a very simple, straightforward role-playing game, or creating its own little system. And you'd have to figure out whether you would be playing the classic characters from the series, or whether you'd be playing descendants of those characters, or whether you'd be playing some kind of investigators with it. There's a lot of kind of crunchy stuff you'd have to figure out and try to figure out what the audience for the game, what the people that would buy it would want most in a Dark Shadows role-playing game. It's possible. Sometimes you put a lot of energy into creating something that's new and different, and people go, "Oh, I just wanted to replay the TV series."
Right.
So it's possible that might be where people would want to go. It's possible that, if that was the case, it might even be better off as some kind of an interesting board game rather than a full RPG. Or, obviously there's the chance to kind of do hybrids and stuff. I think there's definitely the possibility is there, and I think it could be done. And if the people that hold the license, if the Dark Shadows licensors are interested in that, I'm certainly willing to take a stab at it, and I could recruit enough people, enough great designers and people that are interested to put together a pretty great Dark Shadows role-playing game.
Wonderful. And
including people like Mark, in some sense, those of us that are monster kids are kind of a small community in terms of, a lot of the people that I know, and I know a lot of the people that and there's quite a bit of overlap. Not completely, but it's kind of a close-knit thing, which is good from the sense of getting things together and doing them, but might be bad in the sense of it might be the market is just not big enough that we can afford what the licensing fee would be that they would want. And that certainly has kept things from happening in the past. I mean, that's why it's lack of money, I think, that keeps us from having It Conquered the World out on DVD or Blu-ray, right?
Sure, yeah.
Because she wants more money than Susan Hart wants more money than people want to pay to do it. So there is an economics factor. And if there weren't, heck, if you want to give me the Dark Shadows licensing and we'll split the profits.
There we go. There we go. Yeah. I mean, I think Kickstarter is a good way to go, and having incentives and things to unlock, like as fans contribute. Dark Shadows fans tend to support anything with the Dark Shadows. Like, I have a checkbook cover that has the Dark Shadows logo on it. I mean, it's like they'll put the Dark Shadows logo on something and fans will buy it. If you do a full-on role-playing game, I guarantee even people that don't play role-playing games will still get the book because they'll want to have that in their collection, and then you do the modules, you have the adventures that you bring up a good point. Like, what is the angle? Like, are you somebody who's coming to Collinsport and becomes involved in the intrigues there? Are you a member of the Collins family? Are you somebody who lives in town who's investigating what happens up at Collinwood? Like,
are you ghosts? I mean, there's
I like that.
Smith is done a role-playing game where you're all ghosts.
Ooh, that's awesome. That would be very Dark Shadows. Like, because with Dark Shadows, the the monsters end up being the kind of the stars of the show, and
right.
So that makes sense. Yeah, I could definitely see that. Wonderful. Well, let's hope, fingers crossed, that happens. If Jim Pearson or if anybody from Dan Curtis Holdings is listening, I will put Stephen's website right there in the show notes, and you can always reach out to me too, and I will pass the message along.
And I'm easy to find on Facebook as well. So
awesome. All right. Well, speaking of the monsters being the stars of Dark Shadows,
I know it's funny that they did that twice in a big way, without actually intending for it to happen either time.
And of course, we're about to visit another huge introduction here into the Dark Shadows universe. There are two big introductions here, actually, that happen. We are going to be discussing the storyline that introduced Stephen to Dark Shadows, which is the ghost of Quentin Collins and the werewolf Chris Jennings storyline. Two sort of concurrent storylines that end up being connected in some respect as we learn as we go along. And this storyline dovetails with the end of the Adam storyline. The Adam storyline is wrapping up as Chris Jennings arrives in Collinsport, played by Donald Briscoe, who we previously saw as the twin of Chris Jennings, Tom Jennings, who
the vampire
became a vampire, and was destroyed twice. Barnabas finally dispatched him with the Peter Cushing style, the horror drag with the candlesticks Barnabas used to make the cross were a little smaller than the ones Peter Cushing used as Van Helsing, but it still got the job done. The sun rose, Tom was destroyed, and Chris Jennings shows up, Joe Haskell's cousin, shows up looking for his brother. So we meet this character who seems like a nice guy, but there's a sadness to him.
Yes, he's haunted. Just before we go further forward, just so people do know, I said I'd watched Dark Shadows through the end, and I did. And I've also watched the beginning as well. I did go back later on. And through reruns and the Sci-Fi Channel and various other means. My guess is that I've seen all of them twice, and I've seen parts of it 4 or 5 times or more. But I haven't kept close track. So just so people know, and they're like, well, why is he talking about this? He doesn't know anything that happened before. I think all of us Dark Shadows fans managed to find a way.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. It was like the period of syndication was in the 70s and in the 80s. Dark Shadows was in syndication. I know I watched it out of Channel 58 in Vineyard Haven out in Cape Cod, and they were broadcasting it. And my uncle got the roof antenna so we could watch it. And this was
right. I remember hearing about that.
Yeah, it was awesome. We taped it, and this was like early VCR days. He was the first person I knew who had a VCR. I think he was 82 when he got a VCR. So we started when it started airing. Like he started recording them off Channel 58, and they ran it all the way up until into Parallel Time, which was the end of the syndication package. So I got to watch a pretty substantial amount of Dark Shadows during that time. But of course, the last year of the show and the first year of the show, pre-Barnabas, were not released to syndication. So I finally got to see those when MPI Home Video started putting out the VHS tapes. And my part-time job, I was working at my uncle's clothes store. All the money I made from that job was like went to MPI because I wanted to get those tapes, or because they were kind of expensive.
Well, yeah, if you're buying the individual episodes, they're still fairly expensive. I was one of those people that was unfortunate enough to I'd been collecting the DVD sets over a number of years, and I had just gotten to the point where it didn't make any sense for me to go to the coffin box because I only had X number of DVD sets left to get. And it would have meant the coffin box was like, well, look, at the time, the coffin box was $500, we'll say. Ooh. And collecting the ones that I still didn't have as individual sets was like 400 or something. Yeah. It was a very close call.
It's an investment for sure.
Yep, for sure.
I had the tapes. I had all the tapes. And I ended up, once I got the individual volumes on DVD, like my late husband has like birthday presents and stuff, or Christmas presents, I'd always say, say, what do you want, baby? I'd say Dark Shadows DVDs. Like I was trying to like replace the tapes with the DVDs. So,
Yes.
and I'd buy them too periodically when they were on sale. So eventually I replaced all the VHSs. I sold the VHSs, although the covers were gorgeous for those, the pictures, all of them, like over 200 different photographs, but they take up so much space. So I
Right.
sold,
Well, exactly. You know, I've got the complete set that way, and it's probably at least 8 linear feet of shelf space.
Totally. It totally
for all
is.
of them.
It really,
Too deep. It's just, it's an amazing amount. And part of me is like, if I just waited and got the coffin, it's probably much less.
I have to admit, then later also got the coffin when it was on sale. So I had to have because that thing is so cool, like the complete series and the coffin set.
Right. And I think they may have updated some of the video presentations, which I haven't even really dared to go look at. Anyway, so both of us have a lot of Dark Shadows.
Yes. Yeah. It's like the Universal too. It's like when they released the Universal horror films, it's like, well, I already have these on DVD, but these DVDs are different. And oh, look, the Blu-rays.
I swear that the Universal Blu-rays are the last ones I'm buying.
Me too. Same. I got the Blu-rays and I'm done until the next. No. So speaking of Universal, so we've had our Dracula analog, we've had our Frankenstein analog, and now here's our Larry Talbot.
Right.
Jennings, the Larry Talbot of Dark Shadows, the Wolfman. He is a werewolf, which Dan Curtis was reluctant to introduce a werewolf. You know, you kind of had to do a werewolf. He's the werewolf after the vampire and Frankenstein. The werewolf is just a natural progression there. And I think Dan Curtis was initially reluctant because he always kind of felt that werewolves were a little hokey. But I think clearly he relented and embraced the full moon here because an iconic character played by Don Briscoe, but the werewolf role when he transformed was played by stuntman Alex Stevens. He played both werewolves on the show, and he was amazing, sensational stuntman and performer, very feral in his portrayal and really just wild. He was like an animal. I mean, he really channeled that inner animal, and he was a Lon Chaney fan.
And it shows the way he plays the werewolf. It's just, it's very obviously influenced by Lon Chaney Jr., who kind of used to, it was like his id. He would really let his dark side out when he was playing the Wolfman, and you could see it all the time when he was playing it. And that came right into Dark Shadows. And of course, as a kid, I had no idea that it was a different person playing it. They put him in the same clothes. He was a Wolfman now. Yeah. And as far as I was concerned, it was Don Briscoe.
Same. I thought it was him for years until I think I was reading in one of Catherine Lee Scott's books when I was a teenager. I said, oh gosh, it wasn't him. It was somebody else. I just assumed it was him. Yeah. So what were your thoughts on the werewolf, Chris Jennings?
The werewolf was why I was watching the story, right? It was like, because it was like a continuation of the Wolfman in some sense. And he had that haunted feeling, and he had that pathos, which not only comes from Lon Chaney around that time, but we also got some of that in the Fugitive. I don't know if you've ever watched the Fugitive show with David Jansen, where he's kind of on the run. He can never stay in one place very long because he's got this terrible secret that he's been convicted of his wife's murder, though he didn't do it. So it's definitely got some of that 60s holdover from The Fugitive, which was an immensely popular show. And then they repeated that somewhat in The Invaders, which I don't know if you ever watched.
With Roy Thinnis.
With Roy Thinnis and The Invaders, right? It was in the later Dark Shadows reboot, I think, right? Yeah.
Yep, he was right.
So there was that zeitgeist was going on too. So it was really compelling to have this werewolf character. And as a young kid that's kind of leaning toward teenagehood around that time, werewolves are really kind of a teenage thing. Teenagers, who hasn't felt like a werewolf when they were a teenager, who wasn't a little out of control and stuff. And and at the same time, one of the things Dark Shadows really appeals to, I think, is people that were kind of outsiders from the mainstream. And as a sick kid who couldn't get out much, couldn't do a lot of running, that kind of stuff, all of the monster characters appealed to me. And Dark Shadows and the werewolf are certainly part of that. And, it's like, who wouldn't want to be a werewolf and really cut loose against the people who really tick you off? And that kind of stuff.
Right. I think and this is a recurring theme that comes up a lot in this podcast, is that feeling like an outsider and connecting to those characters who were other in the show, and who were monsters, supernatural characters.
I think Dark Shadows speaks to the misfits in everyone. And for a brief time, that group of everyone really expanded and became huge and popular and, created the entire, as far as I'm concerned, Dark Shadows created the entire supernatural boom in the 70s, right up until we got to the Halloween slasher epic that then kind of took it over.
Totally. Yeah.
There was so much stuff on television. There's so many TV movies that had supernatural themes that owe their existence to Dark Shadows, not, including the Night Stalker, as far as I'm concerned, which obviously was, produced by Dan and that kind of stuff. So it all goes back to this and carrying it forward. Mm-hmm. And I think in some ways, the Werewolf introduced a different kind of supernatural element to the series. It was a similar element to the Barnabas element, but it was much more supernatural in some ways than the Frankenstein element, which always seems kind of uneasy with the rest of the series. I mean, yeah, we've got Angelique and we've got Nikki hanging around and all this kind of stuff, but it's never kind of quite coherent. And I was reading online on, I think, the Dark Shadows a Day site, which is a really amusing site about
the Dark Shadows Everyday blog.
Yeah, I love that. I love that blog.
Yeah.
And because we were going to do this, I was kind of reading some of his blogs from around the era and how kind of tangled in what conflicted direction, which way they were going to go, that they got right during the Adam storyline. It was like they had a really clear direction with Barnabas, and we got back to Barnabas's origins, and then we hit the Adam storyline, the Frankenstein storyline, and they didn't seem to kind of know what they wanted to go. But once that ended, which was luckily right when I started, because it was kind of a hot mess at the end of the Adam storyline, it seemed like they resolved which direction they were going to go, and they were going to go with Sam and Gordon Russell and the writers that really wanted to kind of push the edge into serious supernatural territory again. And the Werewolf was one of the first manifestations of that.
Right.
And then immediately at the same time as the Werewolf, and of course they're connected, but we didn't know this when it started, you get Quentin's ghost.
Yes. Quentin's ghost, of course, is the other big storyline that's happening here concurrently with the Werewolf storyline. And the ghost of Quentin Collins and Beth Chavez, it's Turn of the Screw. So we're doing the Turn of the Screw by Henry James, and we're doing the Wolfman, basically the Universal Wolfman. A lot of elements from the Universal Wolfman are worked.
Right, because the Universal Wolfman is the
template, the
template that all these follow, and it was completely created by Kurt Siodmak.
It really was, yeah.
All of the stuff, the Silver Bullets, and all the stuff we think about of the Werewolf is stuff that he cobbled together from ancient legends that really didn't have any overlying themes.
Right.
And he created this werewolf that ever since it's like, the werewolf, you kill him with silver bullets, he turns in the full moon, he sees the pentagram in the hand.
There's some precedent. There's some precedent for the silver bullet thing, but it just in like you said, in folklore. But there's also the full moon, which he introduced that into that. Of course, we had Werewolf of London as well with Henry Hull, but I think the Wolfman, like you said, just really set the stage for what we think of as werewolf lore to this day. And he incorporated all of the disparate sort of folklore and created some of his own folk, like the pentagram, seeing the pentagram and the palm.
Yeah, and even the silver bullet wasn't a big thing in the folklore. There was, I think, the Beast of Gévaudan was killed with a silver bullet that had been blessed by, I don't remember if it was the Pope or someone, a cardinal or something. But there wasn't a lot of silver bullet stuff going on. And Siodmak said he stole it from the Lone Ranger.
Right.
He thought that would be cool.
Right. And then we had, of course, there was Montague Summers who did the English translation of the Malleus Maleficorum, and he wrote all these books on, he was clearly like a gothic horror aficionado. This because in the 1920s he was publishing like books like The Vampire, His Kith and Kin, and A History of Witchcraft, and all these different books and books about werewolves. He had
there were supposedly, I think the Book of the Werewolf, is that one of his? That's kind of like, it's a history.
Yeah.
It's more than a novel, but
he did a ton of them. He did a whole bunch of them, and he ostensibly like interviewed all these people and stuff, and incorporated all they're very dense books, but they're really kind of fun that they exist, you know. But anyway, and speaking of that, like I've often heard people say, "Oh, Dark Shadows contradicts a lot of the lore about like vampires and werewolves and stuff." And I actually find that Dark Shadows is pretty good at using that existing lore that exists, like the silver thing, like the werewolves, the silver bullet thing and the full moon thing, and seeing the pentagram on the next victim. And that stuff is all was there, or with vampires not casting reflections or being destroyed by a wooden stake or repelled by a holy symbol. Like, I think that Dark Shadows did actually incorporate a lot of established rules about monsters. I don't know why sometimes people say, "Oh, Dark Shadows always contradicts that stuff." I don't find that that's the case.
I agree with you, and I think that the reason people say that is because they are used to brand X vampire, brand Y werewolf. That it's like any vampire that differs from the universal vampires or from, you know, the Hammer vampire, or, you know, it's like the universal vampires and the Hammer vampires are two very different sets of vampires.
Yeah.
But people will get fastened onto one of them and then expect all the other ones that are going to be that way. You know, it's like, I like Vampire the Masquerade, and all vampires should be like the vampires.
Right. And if it's not, it's wrong. They're wrong if it's not like that. And that's not the case. It's like people bring their own interpretation to it or pick and choose the things they want to use. But I think Dan Curtis and the writers tended to be pretty on the nose in terms of a lot of the lore that they would incorporate into Dark Shadows for like.
And I think they picked the stuff that was most interesting a lot of the time and would most play to the storylines that they were trying to tell. You know, as a writer, that's one of the things you try to do. You know, it's like in Dr. Cushing, there's a major werewolf character, and he's got pieces from the Wolfman, and he's got pieces from, you know, other werewolf sources, Dark Shadows certainly. And then there's pieces that were like, well, here's my little twist that maybe you never thought of before.
Yeah.
And that's basically what all writers do all the time. Is you seldom do you create anything wholly out of your imaginations or stuff, unless you're some kind of a Lovecraftian genius that creates all these strange things that no one seems to have ever thought of before.
Sure.
But most of us find stuff in the folklore, or we find stuff in other things we've admired, and we take that and we synthesize it into what works for us in the story that we're doing. And clearly Dan and the writers, being majorly Sam Hall and Gordon Russell, I think at this point, it's Violet Wells. No, she's a little later.
She comes when 1897 rolls around.
Right. I think we're at the tail end of Ron Sprout here.
Yeah. Yes.
You know, but clearly Gordon and Sam and Dan are kind of all on the same page and synthesizing this stuff and moving it forward, not to cut Ron Sprout not to be too cruel to him at all.
No, I know. Danny Horn in his blog is not a big enthusiast for Ron Sprout.
Right. Well, and he's my least favorite of the Dark Shadows writers, I think, in a lot of ways.
There was a conflict between him and Sam Hall. Like Sam Hall really wanted to push it, you know, more into like fully embracing all the craziness, and Ron Sprout wanted to kind of dial it back, do a lot of repeating for people who may have missed an episode. And I think it became like, if you miss an episode, tough, you know, like you gotta watch.
And God bless Ron, because that's probably the reason that I could see sporadic episodes at the beginning of the Quentin and the Werewolf storyline and feel like I missed nothing when they finally brought it to where I could see it in the afternoons. I mean, I felt, it's funny, rewatching the series recently, I was like, God, I didn't see this. I didn't see this. I just got really lucky in the episodes that I did see. And then they started broadcasting it when I could see everything. You know, it was like there was a 2-month period of transition there for me, where somehow I was always sick or it was the holidays or whatever when the werewolf was on. Quentin was on.
And I love how they built up the appearance of the werewolf, because it's only hinted at first. Like, you're not exactly sure what's happening. I mean, I think if you probably figure it out, before it happens, but Chris chains himself up in gets the hotel room at the inn. Mr. Wells comes back, the innkeeper, played by Conrad Bain from the very early episodes, the pre-Barnabas episodes. I mean, he was, a day player in a couple of episodes early on. And here he is back again. It's like 2 years later. It's so amazing that they actually brought him back to get killed by the werewolf, and one of the rare kind of gruesome scenes you see on because Dark Shadows didn't do a whole lot of gore. Dan Curtis wasn't a big fan of gore. I'm not either. I think gore kills the gothic mood if you overdo gore. I tend
to agree with you too. I'm not a huge gore fan.
Yeah, I think hints of it are fine, but like a splash of blood, but instead of like buckets of blood. But you see the innkeepers mauled and kind of shredded up, and then Elizabeth hears an animal in the woods growling, and she sees it, and she says it's wearing the clothes of a man. And then we finally get to see Chris Jennings finally transform into the werewolf with that great Vinnie Lascalzo makeup. But he crashes through that window in the Blue Whale, as you described, with the waitress killing the. Oh my God, that's just such a dynamic scene with jumping through that window. And the Blue Whale was such an explosive, memorable scene on the show. Like, rarely did you see things like that in Dark Shadows. That took it to another level.
You didn't see that kind of stuff in daytime television at all.
Oh yeah, totally. And so as this continues, we see Chris Jennings has a young sister. The parents have died. Her brother, Tom, who she was living with, has died. So she's at Wyncliffe. She's a very troubled young girl, played by Denise Nickerson, who, of course, went on to great fame as Violet Beauregard in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory.
Yep, God love her.
Yeah. Sadly, she passed away a few years ago. I was so sad when I heard that.
She was kind of my age, too. It's just like, what?
Yeah. Oh,
I hate to lose the young ones here. I still think of myself as young, even though, yes, I saw Dark Shadows, its original run for at least half the series. So,
hey, that's still young. Anyway, so we have Amy. She's a very troubled person. Denise Nickerson was so good at playing this haunted young child, very spooky, strange, sad.
She and David Hennessy really work well together. It's like she's clearly troubled, and we know he's been troubled ever since the start of the series. And when I was a kid, those kids gave me the creeps.
Yes. Well,
they gave me the creeps with this haunted telephone thing and all that. Just suddenly they're talking to people that aren't there. And I have to say, I could be wrong. Maybe I'm, when I rewatch the Gerard stuff, I'll feel differently. But rewatching the Quentin stuff recently, Quentin is I think the scariest ghost ever on Dark Shadows.
Quentin was scary.
Menacing.
Scary, played by the wonderful, legendary David Selby. Huge addition to Dark Shadows. I mean, you had Barnabas, you had Julia came in, you had Angelique, and Quentin, he for sure is the next big introduction into the show. Quentin Collins, the ghost. When I was a kid, I've talked about Barnabas scaring me before. I'd had nightmares about Barnabas. I also had nightmares about Quentin Collins. He was terrifying when I was a kid watching the show. I think it was the fact that he imposed his will in such a sinister way on these children through the use of that very eerie 19th century music that would possess them. They would lose their own sense of self.
And the telephone, too.
And the telephone,
And you would never hear him. One of the things that I think makes him super creepy when Quentin shows up is you never know when they're going to hit a spotlight in the back of the room somewhere, and there he's going to be, which is always kind of like, whoa.
Totally.
But there's also the fact that he never speaks.
Yes.
You hear his laughter maybe sometimes, but he never talks. You never hear him say anything. He only laughs. And Beth only cries.
Yes.
That makes them creepier.
Yeah. And he has such an iconic look as well, with the frock coat and those sideburns, the mutton chop sideburns, and the sort of the pale, ghostly look to him. And Beth, this weeping, sad spirit.
And the lighting, they're always really, really good with the lighting on Quentin the Ghost. It's always just super eerie.
Yes.
You know, it's sometimes people say that Dark Shadows is just a soap opera, but there's almost nothing that Dark Shadows was doing by this time that looks anything like another soap opera from the era.
No, it's a soap opera in structure only, in terms of that it aired daily and it was a serialized narrative. But by that
it
logic,
moves when Ron Sproat's not writing it. It moves kind of at the speed of light too. Maybe early on you could miss an episode, but people would say it takes Dark Shadows is so slow. It's like, what are you watching, dude? Have you ever seen an actual soap opera? You know, the actual soap opera it takes a whole week to get to the next story point. In Dark Shadows, you were having story points every day, sometimes a couple in one episode. Yeah. It's kind of amazing, but they had that going for them. And then they had this the people who were working there were doing stuff with lighting that just wasn't being done on other soap operas. And they were trying new ways to show the ghosts and to show the supernatural elements. And they got better and better as they went. Sure, maybe early on you saw the plastic seam on the skeleton's head or something, but as they went along, everybody improved. It's one of those things when you're working in that kind of a situation where it's all very high pressure and you all have to kind of be together. One of the wonderful things that happens is that everybody ups everybody else's game. So suddenly the actors are getting better and the lighting guys are getting better and the camera technicians are getting better and the guy doing special effects getting better. And I really feel like, having just watched this segment again fairly recently, it's a big step up in the production from even the stuff that they were doing in the Adam storyline just before it.
You can tell too that I think Dan Curtis was a big fan of The Turn of the Screw and the Innocents, the stage adaptation and the film adaptation as well. Which there are a lot of things you will see from The Innocents that will make their way into this. The whole scene with it was Deborah Kerr as the governess and Peter Wingard as the ghost of Peter Quint, who Quentin was named. The name was inspired by Peter Quint. That whole scene with Miles standing in front of the window and Peter Quint laughing behind Miles and Miles laughing. And they did something similar with David, where David's on the bed and he's laughing and you hear Quentin laughing in the house. Like just that parallel of the two of them laughing, like they've become synonymous with each other. David is fully corrupted now by Quentin. It's such a disturbing and eerie ghost. Some people dislike The Turn of the Screw. I don't understand those people. I think The Turn of the Screw. The Turn of the Screw is great. The big difference, though, is Miss Jessel. Miss Jessel in The Turn of the Screw and in The Innocents is much more malignant. She's evil. There's something evil about Miss Jessel. Beth is not, though. There's something just sad about Beth. Right. Terry Crawford.
Beth is tragic.
Yeah, Beth is tragic. Terry Crawford was very sad. When they redid The Turn of the Screw with Gerard and Daphne, I felt Daphne was at least a little closer to Miss Jessel. You don't know where Daphne's loyalties lie. She can be a little sinister, but even then, she's not all the way at Miss Jessel level. But Quentin is fully at the Peter Quint level of malignancy and corruption. He is bad news and is a huge introduction into the show with Quentin.
Right. So, and, it quickly became fascinating to the fans. And it's hard to remember so long ago. I think when he is the ghost, Quentin, he's just scary. Mm-hmm. And I don't remember if it took until we actually get to see him in the flesh for him to become kind of, a fan favorite. Yes. For him to become really fascinating. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a big credit to David Selby too, that again, this character was like Barnabas, he was one of these 13-week wonders. Mm-hmm. We're going to have this guy in, and he's going to stay there for 13 weeks, and I'll get rid of him, and on we'll go.
It was to give Jonathan Frid a break, because Jonathan Frid was really overworked. I mean, he was in tons of episodes and had these very lengthy, monologues and lots of dialogue. It was very difficult for him.
Right.
So bringing in another character like that, to have another sort of monster, I guess, to sort of help carry the load was a godsend to him, and I think David Selby they did a Zoom interview with several of the actors from Dark Shadows to talk about the Dark Shadows, the Jonathan Frid documentary. And that was discussed, and Jonathan was actually grateful to David Selby for kind of helping to carry the load. The character definitely took off big time in 1897 when we finally got to hear him speak. But I think even prior to that, there was a mystique there and an intrigue about this ghost who didn't speak. It was, like you said, I mean, just David Selby's presence and his performance in the role really made you believe that this was an evil specter who was set loose now in Collinwood.
You're tempted to say that they got lucky in the casting, but Dark Shadows got lucky in their casting so many times. Clearly, not a lot of luck was involved. Clearly, they actually had a really good sense of who to cast and what roles.
I will say this too. I think with Quentin too, with Quentin's ghost, even though he doesn't talk and he is sinister, there is still a charm to him. He's charismatic.
He is.
I mean, he's clearly very...
And he's sexy.
He's sexy.
He's a sexy ghost. You can get that. And you get that connection between him and Beth, that there's something sexual going on between these two, that they're somehow linked. Even if you haven't seen or read Turn of the Screw, without any context, just the way that the writers set them up, you know that they're connected. You know that there's some kind of romantic / sexual connection to them. And as you said, David's a very charismatic guy, and he could just stand there in sinister lighting and give you a kind of a little cock of his head, a little look of his eyes, a little slight smirk, and you could hear the women melting all across America.
Sure. But he also
more than women probably, but those so inclined, melting all across America.
Well, but he was also in the sense that you can see. I'm not only talking about sexy, but also you can see how this character could be an influence on the children. Like he would sway the children and impose his will on them to have them do things for him and play the game, which becomes a recurring thing where initially it's fun for David and Amy to play the game. And David Hennessy is also a great actor who doesn't get enough credit. He was kind of on the back burner a bit during the Addams storyline. He was here and there, you'd see him, but here he's really back and with Amy, and they're the Miles and Flora characters. And initially they're having fun talking to this ghost and seeing Quentin and Beth, and let's go see Quentin
and making the adults squirm.
Yes.
Which is something that, kids like to do. Kids like to make adults squirm. Maybe, it's like, it's been a while since my kids grew up, but back then it was like, these kids they're sticking it to the man.
Yes. Yeah. So they're having fun with it, but it becomes progressively more disturbing
and dangerous
the things that they're doing. They string a wire across the stairs to try to kill Roger. David's second murder attempt on Roger, I might add, trying to kill Roger. Eventually Quentin tries to get David to poison Chris Jennings for whatever reason, we don't know, and Quentin ends up doing it himself because he's gaining in power. Quentin and Beth are now starting to be able to leave this room because they found Quentin's bedroom, this Victorian bedroom with the wallpaper, the Victorian wallpaper, and there's a skeleton there.
This was a very creepy sequence to me when I was a kid, that they're in a disused wing of the Collins mansion, the West Wing, right? And they found a disused room, and in the disused room, there's a secret panel, but it's not a big one like the one they've got in the library. It's a tiny little panel that they have to crawl through, and they come into this room that's got a skeleton there.
Yeah.
With the old telephone too, as I remember. There's the old telephone they've been talking to him through. The other end is in that room or something. It's just it's very creepy.
Yeah, and that's been there. That skeleton's been there for decades, and nobody knew about it. So they get rid of the skeleton. As things start to get worse here, Elizabeth contacts Professor Stokes. Something's going on here. Professor Stokes thinks that there's an evil presence in the house. Wonderful Thayer David as Professor T. Eliot Stokes.
I was just going to say how much I love Thayer David as Professor Stokes. His other roles that he's played are really good because all of the actors on this are great actors.
Yeah.
And so when I say he's a great actor, in some ways it's like, well, yeah, they all are.
They all are. Yeah.
Amazing. But that Professor Stokes role is something that, well, it certainly has stuck with me as who would you want to be in Dark Shadows? I want to be Professor Stokes. He's the one that knows all this stuff and never gets bitten by the vampires.
Right.
He's got enough power that nothing terrible ever happens to him.
Well, he's the Van Helsing analog.
Yeah,
exactly. He really is, and he's just sensational in the role. But he brings in Madame Findlay, a friend of his who is a psychic medium, and Madame Findlay is killed by Quentin. Quentin is able to sort of, and a lot of the ghosts in Dark Shadows, the evil, powerful ghosts, seem to be able to sort of induce heart attacks in people. They die of heart failure. And Gerard is able to do this as well later on. Madame Finlay dies. This storyline just continues to brew. Meanwhile, Chris Jennings, there's another seance that's held to contact the spirit of Jeff Clark, because there's we're going to cover this in the next episode with another guest of mine. We're going to talk about the 1790 return to 1796, but they're trying to contact Jeff Clark / Peter Bradford. And we get the first sort of appearance by Magda, the gypsy, who speaks through Carolyn and speaks of this curse. And Chris Jennings becomes very uncomfortable and stops the seance. As we're going along, the Chris and Quentin are becoming, there's some connection between them that we don't know about yet, but they're starting to kind of, I think they were already, planning, like, how are we going to connect these two storylines, which is
I think so.
Cool.
Clearly they had some inkling that they were going to connect this two storylines, and we're not actually covering that here today. Right. But it's one of the things that makes this series, what I always think of as the original Quentin series, which starts with his ghost and ends with the end of I think it's 1897, right? Mm-hmm. And ends with the end of that 1897 thing. I think of that as the golden age of Dark Shadows. I know some people might argue the first Barnabas storyline, and I could see that to some extent because obviously Barnabas is really an important character, but at this point it seems like they're really firing on all cylinders, and they haven't gotten burned out yet.
They were heading for the peak here, because when 1897 happened, that's when the story, the ratings were at their highest. And Barnabas ignited the phenomenon, and it just continued to grow as it went on. I always say that the three must-watch storylines. I mean, everybody should watch every episode of Dark Shadows. Absolutely. And the two movies too. Don't worry about the Johnny Depp movie. You can watch the other. You can watch that. Don't watch that. But the show, if you're going to watch the storylines to watch, definitely. The introduction of Barnabas, 1795 and 1897. And I would, this is connected to 1890. It's the prelude to 1897, really.
Exactly. As far as I'm concerned, they're all one thing. And I was actually surprised when you don't want to talk about the 1897 part?
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a big.
And part of me was like, phew, because I haven't gotten through those in my current rewatch yet.
Yeah, no, I do have a guest lined up who's all about 1897. We're going to be doing that,
which is awesome because it is the best time of the show for me, and I got lucky. I started right at the prelude to it, and then followed it all the way through the end.
So Joe Haskell sees his cousin Chris transform into a werewolf. Joe's been through hell. I feel so bad for Joe and Maggie because they're such.
Oh, me too.
They're such nice people. They were such a nice couple, and the presence of the supernatural in Collinsport has completely destroyed their relationship and destroys Joe as a person. And later, Maggie as well. Later, they both end up at Wyncliffe in the sanitarium. They end up in the insane asylum. Joe sees his cousin transform. He just becomes unhinged. He has visions of a werewolf and Tom as a vampire. He's done.
What a sad fate for the character, but as a writer and as a series creator, you know that sometimes your actors are going to want to leave you, and it's a question of what kind of send off you want to give them. At least in his case, they didn't kill him.
Yeah.
Which I always as a writer, I'm always disappointed when the writers of a series just go in and cavalierly kill a longtime character.
Agreed.
And it's like, well, why'd you do that? You didn't need to do that. We don't need to have people die. People die in real life all the time, but we don't need to have that always mirrored in our art. We can have people go off and go to Windcliff, or we can have people move. I mean, the amount of people that you lose as friends because they moved across the country is happily much more than people that are suddenly killed by werewolves.
Indeed. And it does. It leaves the door open. I mean, sadly, he never did return to the show as Joe or Nathan Forbes, but it does leave the door open for future stories. And they did actually, in those Big Finish audios, they had Maggie marry Joe Haskell. She became Maggie Haskell. And I think they even used a clip of Joel Crothers in one of those, his voice, in one of those episodes.
Yeah, because we lost him sadly early during the AIDS epidemic, I think. Awful.
In the 80s. Yeah, very sad.
Awful stuff. So, but he was a terrific actor and a really nice, normal presence on the show. Of course, when I was watching it at the time, I hadn't seen him that much. Coming in when I did, Maggie was always the governess, right?
Yeah, exactly. And she does. This is where she comes in as the governess, because she's lost her father, Sam Evans, who died after being injured by Adam. She's lost Joe now, and so she's living alone in this cottage. And Elizabeth invites her. Elizabeth, we're now at the end of the Elizabeth premature burial storyline, because they were doing that storyline where she's buried alive, and she has this mausoleum built, and she has a bell where she'll ring the bell if she moves. And it's fortuitous in a way that Carolyn is attacked by the werewolf. She's now dating Chris Jennings, because Carolyn always has to date the new monster on the show.
Yeah, she has to date the bad boy. Carolyn has terrible taste in women. She always did, always will.
She's always, So she's.
And I've known people like that. I've known it's like, you're dating this guy. No.
But he sees and he's a nice guy. Chris is a nice guy, but he's so haunted in trouble. He has this curse. He sees the pentagram on her face, and he knows she's going to be the next victim. And he does transform, and he attacks her in the mausoleum, which is a great scene where the werewolf is, trying to desperately to get into the mausoleum, breaks into the mausoleum. Fortunately, she has this silver bracelet, this big cuff silver bracelet. And I love every time when they do this, when somebody's brandishing silver, the light just hits it in a certain way. And then they light the werewolf's eyes, Alex Stevens' eyes, they just go wide. Or whenever he looks at somebody brandishing like a pentagram of protection, like a silver pentagram, his eyes just go really wide, and you can see the terror in his eyes, that this metal of purity that can repel this supernatural being. It's the one thing that works against the werewolf. And then Barnabas comes in, he has the silver-headed cane. Of course, another tie-in to the Wolfman with the silver-headed cane.
Silver-headed wolf cane.
Yes, the silver-headed wolf cane. Perfect. And at the time they introduced Barnabas, they didn't know they were going to have werewolves in the show, but it worked out pretty well.
Right, yeah. Suddenly you've got your main character, who's not a vampire at this point in the storyline,
yes,
has
exactly.
the one thing that can actually defend people from the werewolf, and that's his silver-headed wolf cane.
Yes.
That he's always carried, which is just one of the coolest props ever, too.
Oh, totally. It really is. I have one. I got one years ago from a fanzine that somebody was selling the actual company, that made the canes.
I have a near approximation of it. Mm-hmm. It's not quite right, but it costs about $40 as opposed to like $400.
Yeah. It was expensive to buy that. I had to pay in installments. I remember through somebody kindly in the back pages of one of the Dark Shadows fanzines let me send in, a few bucks every month, and eventually they said I still have it. The German silver.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's really cool. So Barnabas, beats the werewolf with the cane. Barnabas and Julia eventually do figure out that Barnabas figures out it's a werewolf, and he figures out that it's Chris Jennings is the werewolf, and he feels kinship with him. Like Barnabas is cured, quote unquote, cured at this point, but he is not a vampire now. Of course, he will return to that state down the road, but he feels sympathy for Chris Jennings, and there's sort of a bond there that forms. He's sent as a kindred spirit in him and wants to help him.
And that's really kind of touching. I think it's really terrific at this point in the storyline that Louis Edmonds must have been off doing somewhere. Joan Bennett was in her crypt, and there's a point of time during this part of the storyline where Barnabas he's the head of the household.
Yeah.
It's like the other grown-ups, Carolyn's too young. The other grown-ups have left him in charge. It's
Yeah.
like, he's a vampire, right? Well, of course they don't know he's a vampire. And he's
Yeah.
not a vampire right now. But there's some wonderful scenes with him kind of acting as the head of the family, the head of the Collins family, that you don't normally get. And him both trying to protect the household and trying to help Chris, who he and Julia have cleverly figured out. Can I talk about Barnabas and Julia? As I've gotten older, I've read a lot of stuff about Julia being in love with Barnabas, and obviously they played that angle up in the Depp movie. And as a kid, I never really saw it. And I kind of still don't in a lot of ways. Maybe as I go even further into my current rewatch, I'll go, oh yeah, she's macking on him totally. But as a kid, I thought, these two are just best friends. It's like his best friend happens to be this wacky mad scientist doctor. And he treats her like a best friend.
He does. There are references throughout the series. She doesn't often say it, but she does have those feelings for Barnabas, but he does not reciprocate those feelings. And I don't think he ever will. I know a lot of fans do the shipping or whatever,
Right. Yeah. No.
And for years they've done that. And it's like, I see them also as best friends. They're best friends, but I think Julia would have liked more than.
I think I can see that. I can see that maybe she wanted more. But at first, to me, he was a science experiment for her.
Yes, totally.
And then she became kind of charmed with him. And maybe at some point there, she was thinking, well, maybe if I cure him, he'll do something for me. But by this point, maybe there's still some undercurrent, and they love each other for sure.
Yeah.
He loves her as much as he can love anyone that is not a reincarnation of Josette. They love each other, but I don't think they love she loves him in a I want to be a couple with you way. I think they love each other in kind of a family way. It's like they bonded through his trials, and now they are the two of them are a family within this larger family.
Right. They're the ones.
I love that.
Yeah, definitely. And then later on, I think, Willie is kind of part of that group. And later,
Willie is he's like the third member of their micro family within the family.
Sure. And then I will add Quentin to that later too. When we come back from 1897, Quentin then joins the crew, and he's part of that gang as well, I think. But we'll talk about that later. So Julia reluctantly agrees to try to help Chris. She starts doing all this research into lycanthropy. We get a little bit more information about how one becomes a werewolf. It could be a curse. It could be if you're bitten by a werewolf and you live. They mention some of that, but of course we'll learn it was a curse that was passed down through the generations. Maggie's invited by Elizabeth to be the governess at Collinwood. And we see this dynamic develop now with, again, another parallel to Turn of the Screw. Maggie becomes the governess in the novel, and Mrs. Johnson comes to the fore once again, the wonderful Clarice Blackburn, as the Mrs. Gross character. So Maggie and Mrs. Johnson are the ones who start to suspect something bad is happening to the kids. Like they know something is up. Mrs. Johnson actually ends up seeing Quentin at one point. People won't believe poor Mrs. Johnson. And it's really fun. But Maggie starts to believe it because she starts to see signs of what's happening with the children. They're acting very strange. It's interesting. Quentin doesn't, he's not happy with Maggie kind of being onto him. So he's having the kids play. Amy is even starting to get a little worried because Quentin is getting worse, and David is kind of going with it still. And
they're kind of okay when it seems like they're kind of pranks or they're getting back at somebody. When they start picking on Maggie, then the kids start to kind of go, well, wait a minute.
I think it's
because everyone loves Maggie.
Yeah,
I mean, Maggie.
If they
Catherine Lee Scott was one of the first women I ever fell in love with. Right, she's so wonderful in the show. Yeah. As an act, her acting is just fabulous and stuff, and she's the normal person.
Yeah, she
amid
is.
all of this. Even though she's a governess, which is not something I really understood as a kid. I'm like, what is this? Okay, she's like their living teacher. I get it. Okay,
sure.
It never happened anywhere I knew, but okay, I could go with it. All the other people are kind of cursed and haunted, including Roger and Elizabeth, right? And the kids and Clarice Blackburn, Mrs. Johnson works for them. So but Maggie's like, she's the normal person.
Yeah.
She's the normal one. She's taken over what we now know is, the Victoria Winters role. She's the normal one amid all these crazy people.
Right. Because, of course, Victoria has now been sucked into the past, and
just in time, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, Alexandra Moltke, of course, had left the show and was replaced by Betsy Durkin for a short time, and then who will then be replaced by Carolyn Groves during a side trip and a storyline within a storyline. They kind of do the side trip to 1795.
Right.
But the kids start, they do the Mr. Juggins, the mannequin to make Maggie look like she's crazy. David has gotten pretty bad. Like, I think even Amy is like, David, you're acting just like Quentin. Like, he's being really getting worse. He does the whole, I do not like the Dr. Fell, the reason why I cannot tell, all of that stuff.
But this I know him very well. I do not
like the Dr. Fell. Oh, it's so.
See, I remember that from when I was a kid. That was creepy then. It's creepy now.
Isn't it? Is it? Same reaction. I was like, oh, that is so creepy. And then I kept saying it too. I was like,
right, exactly.
But Beth, the spirit of Beth, is now also concerned because Quentin is becoming more evil. His actions are more evil. She leads, especially when he tries to kill Chris and all this, she leads Chris to this grave, an unmarked grave. Chris and Barnabas dig it up. It's a skeleton of a baby, and there's a pentagram, again, linking it to the werewolf and linking there was a werewolf at Collinwood, they deduce at some point in the past. Quentin doesn't like any of this. This is going on. Barnabas contacts the people who made this. Was Braithwaite and Son, and it was Ezra Braithwaite, who was a young man at the time, was played by Abe Vigoda, who seemed to have always played old men, no matter what.
He was never young.
never. It's like he was always
never
old.
Young.
He just was born old. And he plays Ezra Braithwaite in a memorable scene where Quentin, he can't see him with his glasses on, and then he puts his, I know you, you're Quentin Collins. And David Selby's smiling, Quentin's smiling and nodding. It's just such a great scene because he's eating it up. That's what I mean. Like, there's a charm to Quentin, even though he's evil. It's kind of like he's really kind of enjoying this whole.
I'm smiling, and now I'm going to kill you.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. You don't see Gerard smile to me. Gerard's always sneering. Like Quentin has that big grin on his face. Then he kills Ezra Braithwaite. Quentin attempts to strangle Maggie. David is pushing back. Quentin sets David's arm, makes David think his arm is on fire, and it actually manifests on his arm.
Yep.
Really some dark stuff is starting to happen. More darker stuff is starting to happen.
Quentin is the master of supernatural evil powers. Now that Nicholas Blair is gone, Quentin is exhibiting his black magic prowess.
Yeah. Now, what were your thoughts as things were kind of evolving here, heating up, so to speak?
It just got creepier and creepier. And it's like you kind of, as a kid that's relatively the same age as these children, a little bit younger, you kind of understand, hey, we found this ghost. He's our secret friend. We can talk to him on the telephone. We can kind of play some pranks on the adults. And when the adults are not so nice to us, we've got this way of getting back. You can kind of understand the kids falling into it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, as a viewer, you're like, well, maybe this is not such a good idea. Maybe this is not going to just stop with harmless pranks. And the escalation there was, that's one of the reasons I said earlier, and I still believe this is true. Quentin is the scariest ghost that was ever on the show because he did have that charm, and you could see following into his orbit. Yeah. And once you were in his orbit, there's several places where David's like, okay, I'm getting out, and I'm getting out, and I'm out now, and I'm not out anymore.
Yeah. And I love that the writers actually carried this over when they did the flashback to Quentin, because he was like that with Jameson too. He was always trying to get Jameson to do horrible stuff for him to help as his favorite uncle Quentin. He'd say, help me in this black magic ritual to harm somebody. Like, he would use Jameson.
Don't worry, we're just gonna scare him a little.
It's just a game. It's fun. They tie it in, and they didn't. This is the writer. The writers were really firing on all cylinders here. Like, they were really connecting things.
Yeah, Gordon and Sam were doing a fabulous job. Can I digress just for a moment to talk about Gordon Russell?
Sure.
I don't know a lot about Gordon Russell. I'm one of these people that I tend to enjoy art for what it is and don't worry too much about the people behind it a lot of the times. It's like, it took me forever, even as a kid, to learn who all the Beatles were. It was like, oh, it's the Beatles. They make this music. And I don't know who their names are. Gordon Russell, I think, is not maybe talked about enough as a great Dark Shadows writer. Because I know, Sam was kind of the wild and woolly one. Gordon Russell always seems to me like he's the steady hand on the wheel.
He's the backbone.
The backbone of it, the steady progress. I have a weird game that I play with myself still, because it takes so long to watch as the Dark Shadows series. You forget things as you go along. I have a game where I watch an episode, and then I try, just by watching the episode, I try to figure out who wrote the episode.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep.
And almost always the episodes where I go, well, that was really cool, that was a good story turning point, almost all of those episodes at this point are being written by Gordon Russell. Mm-hmm. He's like Sam Hall, but under control in a way. And it's always fascinating to me to watch them. And then the writer game as a writer, I think it's kind of a fun game to play. It may seem insane to anyone else to go, okay, well, the plot advanced here in an interesting way. We didn't have too many speeches that the actors didn't say. It's kind of a story turning point. So I'm thinking maybe Gordon Russell did this, as opposed to, they're maybe a little wordy, but there's there was a lot of interior monologue. That's and things are kind of crazy. That's Sam.
Yep.
So I love Gordon Russell, and he and Sam, I was just watching the transition between this storyline and the 1897 storyline. And usually the writers will write 2 days of episodes back to back. And then there's another writer for 2 days, and then they rotate through usually there were 3 writers at least. And so there'd be 2 by Gordon, 2 by Sam, 2 by Ron, or whoever the rotation is. But when you get to the transition between these two, this storyline and the 1897 storyline, that critical piece, there's a point where Gordon Russell writes like 4 or 5 in a row, and Sam writes 4 or 5 in a row.
Mm-hmm. And then we had Violet Wells as well.
And Violet comes in at that point.
At that point, because she had been ghostwriting some of Gordon's scripts too.
Right.
That's how they knew each other. So he brought her in and introduced her to Dan Curtis, and she came in. And I think I agree when it was 1897, and they were the 3 of them. I think together were a really great team.
Right. And that's why if you read my Frost Arrow series, there are people named after those 3.
Oh, really? Oh, that's great. Oh, that's
I've named characters after Dark Shadows characters for a long time, but there are those 3 writers are called out as part of the ongoing backstory. Usually they're like a servant or someone that they're not one of the main Frost Arrow characters, but they're all in there. You'll see just little tributes to them.
Sensational. Oh, great.
And I've stuck the words Dark Shadows into so many of my books. it'll just be a casual, and he peered into the dark shadows of the corner.
Perfect. Oh, perfect.
I do that constantly.
I love it. I love it.
As a tip of the hat for what is the most influential television show of my life. It's
awesome.
It's my favorite TV show ever.
Wonderful.
We didn't mention that before. It's my favorite TV show. I love this.
Awesome.
Even more than original Star Trek.
Awesome. Well, me too. The same.
So Gordon Russell and Sam Ron is leaving the series at this point. Yeah. And the 2 of them are really clicking. And with Violet, as you said, Violet helping, being a co-writer or ghostwriter with Gordon too.
Sure.
And it shows. It's like suddenly the Addams storyline was a hot mess, and suddenly we're by the end of this.
I liked the Addams storyline. I just think it could have been a little tighter, but I did enjoy it. I think it had the kind of misfortune of being sandwiched in between really, really good storylines, and it's
two of the great storylines.
But I enjoy it. I think the Addams storyline is really fun to watch.
There's a lot of great stuff in it.
Yeah.
But as you said, it's not very tight, and toward the end, it's like really gets really sloppy. kind of near the end.
Yeah, well, the way they kind of got rid of Adam was just really an afterthought almost. It was like, he's been the major character for like 7 or 8 months here. You deserved a better send-off than that. But
yeah, we're going to just go to the other room for a while and I'll work this out.
Yeah, exactly. So
sorry, Adam, never going to see you again.
Yeah, bye.
Hope you enjoy your time there with Richie Cunningham's older brother.
So we're heading toward the end. Things are heating up for Chris Jennings too, because Sabrina Stewart and Ned Stewart have appeared. Roger Davis is back as the very shouty Ned Stewart, and his sister, who is catatonic, played by Lisa Richards, white hair, in a wheelchair, can't speak, and she used to date Chris Jennings. So, of course, we learned she is the first person who saw him transform into a werewolf and survived.
And that's a great escalation of that storyline.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Because it's like, oh my God, what did he do to her? What has happened? And it turns out he kind of didn't do anything to her.
Yeah.
But he just didn't keep her from seeing the werewolf, and that was enough to completely damage her.
Yeah, Ned Stewart is determined to figure out what the heck happened, what Chris did. He thinks Chris did something to cause this. And Sabrina's gradually, there's some gradual hints where she sees Barnabas as wolf head Cain, and she reacts with horror when she sees the wolf, and just really great moments like that. And of course, Sabrina will continue to be, when we return to the present after 1897, she's going to evolve as a character as well and reconnect with Chris. Things with Quentin are also come to a head in one of the most chilling episodes, I thought, where the children finally can't anymore and they beg Quentin to let them go and to leave them alone. And Elizabeth is standing, because Elizabeth doesn't believe Maggie this entire time. The Mr. Juggins, Quentin mannequin, she thinks Maggie is kind of, being hysterical and seeing things. But then she sees the kids just basically have a breakdown and circle her in the room, both talking over each other, saying, please, Quentin, stop. We don't want to do this. And we hate you. Stop. And it's just such an eerie, tragic scene. And then they pass out. And then, of course, there's the scene from The Innocents where David wakes up, and it's just such a chilling scene where he says something very ominous to Elizabeth and then just starts laughing, and you hear Quentin in the house laughing as well. Oh, I love when people say, oh, Dark Shadows isn't scary. I think that is scary because it's that sort of, it's terror versus horror. I don't need to see decapitations and guts. And that's not, to me, that's not scary. That's just special effects. That is the kind of thing that gets under your skin and sticks with you.
Yeah. Having, again, rewatched that fairly recently, it sent chills down my spine. It's like, oh, yeah. I understand why as an 8 or 9 year old that this was super creepy to me.
Yeah.
Because it's really creepy. And again, I go back to my original premise that Quentin is the scariest ghost ever on the show.
Sure.
And then just is.
They finally accept, okay, Collinwood is haunted. We got to get out of here. Barnabas invites them to come to the old house. They have to clear out of Collinwood because the music, Quentin's theme, which of course we didn't talk about too much, but that became an extremely popular standard. It became
Shadows of the Night.
Yes, it's so hilarious. Like you're in an elevator or something and you hear that come on, and it's like, oh my, I cannot believe they're playing Quentin's theme right now.
Right.
It's like if people only knew. Of course, that music originated in Dan Curtis's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in the background. Right. It was just a background tune that Colbert composed, and then they used it in the show, and it just became this huge hit, Billboard hit, but they clear out of the house. Roger says, we'll be back, have no doubt of that. And then you see that beautiful panning shot of all the rooms as Quentin's malignant presence fills each room of Collinwood, and that music with an echo effect added to it eerily fills up the entire house, sort of metaphorically showing us that Quentin has won and taken over the house. And then you see Quentin on the stairway laughing triumphantly.
Top of the stairway is the master of the house.
Yeah.
Laughing triumphantly.
Oh, it's just a great scene. Right. So great ending to the episode too.
Right.
Really, Stokes, prior to that, Stokes, I think I mentioned Stokes had tried to perform an exorcism, which failed as well. Even Professor Stokes couldn't.
One of the few times Professor Stokes whatever he tried didn't really work out.
It didn't work out because Quentin has become too powerful at this point. Even Stokes can't banish him from the house. Everyone's at the old house. Then things even get worse. Chris, they've been putting in the secret room in the mausoleum during the full moons, the phase of the full. On Dark Shadows, they say just the 3 nights of the full moon sometimes.
3 nights of the full moon.
3 nights, which we could say it's the phases of the full moon. Maybe we could, so Chris.
Well, I mean, technically the moon is only full one night, but watching it, looking at it as someone that it's amazing how much more observant of the moon I've become since writing a werewolf character and Dr. Cushing and being really tuned to it. Mm-hmm. You can tell when the moon is not quite full and when it's just past full, but they're so close.
It's so close.
If you only see one of those 3 days, it's a full moon.
Yeah, exactly. Agreed. And I think other films have done that where
usually you go for 3 nights of a full moon, whether it's in film or whether it's Werewolf by Night. Yeah. Because
Werewolf by Night, yes, yeah.
Because otherwise you only get one night of the werewolf and then you have to wait a month.
Yeah, it's like, what fun is that? We gotta. But anyway, even after the full moon, when the day comes, they open the secret room to the mausoleum, and Chris is still a werewolf.
Werewolf, and I'd actually forgotten that until my recent rewatch. I'd forgotten that his disease had progressed in such a way, Quentin's evil had suffused the area in such a way that the full moon is over, and he's still a werewolf locked in the secret room.
I had a theory about that I wrote. I wrote an article for the World of Dark Shadows years ago for their fan page section, where I had a theory. Quentin had been trying to kill Chris prior to this by poisoning him.
Right.
And there's a line during the Leviathan storyline where Jeb Hawk says, if you kill Chris Jennings while he's in human form, if you kill somebody who's a werewolf while they're in human form, they will transform into the werewolf forever and not turn back.
They become a werewolf. Yeah. I had that in the back of my head for a long time, and I know there's some mythology that says that too, but I'd forgotten that that's where it came from.
I wonder if Quentin succeeded in killing Chris at some point, like maybe right before he transformed. I don't know. Like, it's just like, why didn't he turn back? They never really explained it. Maybe it is that the curse has progressed to the point where he's just a werewolf all the time. But I wondered.
And it could be Quentin's, this hadn't occurred to me until we started talking. It could be that, as you said, Quentin's evil influence has expanded so much that it's brought out the evil influence in Chris too, which we find out later is related to Quentin as well. So you could say that. I wrote a follow-up to a movie that ended up not happening, in which there is a werewolf. And one of the things that I decided would be cool in the movie was, if the longer you were a werewolf, the more time the moon would affect you and the more time you would spend as a werewolf. Mm-hmm. So, you might start off with 3 days, but then as time went on, maybe it's 5, and maybe it's not just when the moon is up. Maybe it's, for an hour or two after moonrise and before moonrise and after moonset. But they never explain exactly why, but it's clear that things have gotten worse.
Yeah, something happened. Something took place there. My theory for a long time was that Quentin actually succeeded in killing Chris just
That's not a terrible idea. And because we don't know, and we don't see that story is not resolved at all before we come back from 1897.
No, because when we're back from 1897, Chris is back in his human form, and he's transforming during the full moons again. So things have righted themselves. Whatever happened in the past when Barnabas was back there changed things.
Right. And we don't want to totally reveal that at this point. There'll be other stories and stuff. But clearly that's why Barnabas goes into the past.
The next stage here. So Barnabas and Maggie they're exploring the West Wing, and they find the I Ching wands in Quentin's room, because Quentin was a dabbler in the occult, of course. So he had these mysterious I Ching wands, and they take them away. David, it just gets worse. David falls into a coma. Julia examines David and says, unless something is done quickly, David is going to die by morning. Quentin wants to claim David because he looks just like Jameson.
Right.
We'll later learn is the one person Quentin ever loved was Jameson, his nephew. So we start to get some sympathy for Quentin later on, but he sees Jameson in David, and because Jameson rejected him, he wants to take David into the spirit world and be with David in Collinwood, his like surrogate version of Jameson, his nephew. It's
once we see Quentin is a human being, a real person, we start to understand some of the motivations for his ghost. But as a ghost, he's a totally malignant figure. He has no real redeeming qualities.
Yeah,
he's going to kill the kids so that they will join him as ghosts.
And Beth seems to not be able to stop this. Like when he crosses the line, Beth tries to help the living, by giving them clues as to things, but I think Quentin has attained a level of this evil, malignant power that Beth can't counter at that point.
She is clearly much less powerful than he is. Now, whether that's because of inherent sexism in the 60s or because he was, a dabbler in the black arts when he was alive, it's hard to say looking back on it, but it's very clear. And it could just be that, anger can overpower goodness.
Maybe
for a period of time,
fueled by that desire for, and we don't know what happened in the original run of events, because that skeleton in the room was Quentin originally, because
absolutely,
and the theory I read that I think makes the most sense is that when we see the clues in 1897, the first clue was somebody brought a silver bullet to Collinwood, and it was one of the things Quentin wished had never happened. Somebody probably killed him in the room. Like he probably turned into a werewolf, and they shot him with a silver bullet in his room and killed him in the chair, and he fell into the chair, and then they sealed him up.
And then they sealed up the room in an Edgar Allan Poe-like twist, which we've done before already on the series. Absolutely.
Sure. It's
that's what I always figured. I mean,
Yeah.
Or he could have, despite the werewolf thing, he could have killed himself after the terrible things he'd done.
Sure.
It's hard to say.
And then
and we may never know.
Sure, we may never know. I mean, obviously, Trask ends up in the room. Spoilers, if you haven't seen it. Collinwood must claim its victim for that room. There must be someone who will die in that room.
I've forgotten that.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm sorry.
I always look forward to the way they're going to kill the Trask character.
I'm sorry. Oh, I shouldn't. I figured you.
No, I've seen it. I just didn't. It's like I just got to the point where he's been reintroduced, and they burned down his building. He's going to come and stay with him, and I'm like, I forget how they kill him this time.
Yeah. he's the one who ends up in that chair. So David goes into a coma. Barnabas, in a panic, he finds Professor Stokes and brings Julia and Stokes into the basement of the old house and pleads with presses Stokes rather, to tell him more about the I Ching. And Barnabas is now, he's the protector of the family. He's come quite a long way. He wants to save David, who he used to want to kill. At one time, lest we forget, Barnabas wanted to kill David when he was a vampire. Now he wants to save David's life and save Chris, who can't turn back into a human.
And that's part of the Barnabas becoming the head of the household thing that happened when Elizabeth was quote unquote dead and Roger was away. He kind of took on that role and kept it, even though, they're back. They're actually all living in his house now.
Yeah.
So he's literally the protector of the entire family. They're all under his roof.
Yeah. Exactly.
Which is a huge change from his original vampire storyline.
Right.
And it's one of the reasons I think a lot of us, really fell in love with that character. And it's like he was the bad guy. Now he's the good guy, and he's trying to do what's right. And then things will change again. So
sure. Yeah.
But that's one of the things that made Barnabas so compelling.
He's complex.
At the time, it still does.
Yeah, he's such
it's
a
like
complex.
He was the human trapped inside of the monster. And at this point in this series is when he is in some ways most fully human.
Yeah.
He's not making even when Barnabas was sympathetic, he would have bad moments where he would have bad ideas and make bad decisions. But this Barnabas is not. He's the human Barnabas, and he's the head of the household in a sense, and he's just trying to help all of his. They're not technically his descendants. They're not really his cousins, even though that's what he calls them. He's trying to help his family.
Very distant cousins, I guess.
Right.
Because they're descended from.
They would be cousins like 5 times removed or some crazy thing. I'd have to look at a chart.
Yeah, because they're descended from Daniel. So he uses, he asks Stokes if they can use the I Ching wands to communicate with Quentin. And Stokes says that it's possible, but it's very dangerous for the uninitiated to use the I Ching. So Barnabas tries, he insists. They throw the wands and it forms the 49th hexagram, the hexagram of change, the co-hexagram. And, the whole thing, Barnabas goes into the trance and sees the door, and things don't go as planned. It's not, he doesn't like confront Quentin, of course, he sees the chained coffin that he was in for almost 200 years. That's what he is confronted with when he uses the I Ching. And of course, that's going to lead to 1890. That is our doorway to 1897 and the next big time travel storyline where Barnabas sends his astral spirit into the past to inhabit his body in the coffin, which is a vampire still in 1897.
Which is just super cool.
It really is. It's such a cool way to kind of transition out of this storyline into the 1897 storyline.
And props to Sam and Gordon and Art Wallace and whoever the hell else, Violet, whoever else figured this out as a plot device.
Yeah.
Big thumbs up there because it's just like, wow, as a kid, it blew my mind.
Well,
and of course, it made me want to find out about the I Ching.
Yes,
too, as a child.
Me too.
And because I was born at the right time, the Scholastic Book Club, because of Dark Shadow's popularity, actually would offer things that you would never find at a book club today. So downstairs, I have astrology and other occult games, which I got from the Scholastic Book Club around the same time as I got a volume from the same school book club on classic witchcraft spells, which actually has, it has how to make a magic circle, how to do magic squares,
wow,
all of this stuff from historical sources. And the astrology and other occult games has a section on the I Ching, as well as a section on the tarot cards that I use to this day. I use that book in Dr. Cushing to help with my tarot card readings.
That is awesome. I love that.
It came home from school, folks. This was, the late 60s and early 70s when people didn't believe in that devil crap.
There's a story. I wasn't aware of this until recently. Andrew Higgins, who listens to the show, and I will have him on at some point. He wrote a great article about dark shadows and world building for an academic collection that came out about different fictional worlds and world building. But he pointed out to me that there was a precedent for the I Ching in fiction in one of the pulp magazines. It was a story called The Door Without a Key by Seabury Quinn, where it is the one instance prior to Dark Shadows where the I Ching was actually used as a means of time travel in a very similar way to how Dark Shadows did it. So my guess is they must have had access to that story.
Yeah, I mean, these guys were old enough that the pulp magazines were probably things that they consumed when they were younger.
Yeah.
And you hit across something like that and you remember it, in the same way that we remember Dark Shadows now for it.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, what about the I Ching? And the whole I Ching thing with the you concentrate on the thing and you open the door and all that kind of stuff. That's all not how you usually use the I Ching.
Yeah, no, it's not. No, it's different.
But as a kid, I loved it. And I even remember I made I Ching wands of my own out of popsicle sticks.
Oh, perfect. Awesome. You tried to do some astral projection there. I hope you got. Yeah.
Never could get the door to open. I could look up the hexagrams in my little astrology and other occult games book.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I have some. I got from a zine. Somebody made them, and they made them look just like the Dark Shadows ones. They're made out of wood, and they have the little white line in the middle and stuff. So I still have those. They're
wow. Now you're making me want to have a set, and I don't have a set, and I feel like a bad Dark Shadows fan because I don't have a set of I Ching wands that are actual I Ching wands.
I think most people probably don't. The ones I've seen don't even really look like the Dark Shadows ones. They look a little different. But I saw some fan made a set that they were selling in the back of a zine and those ads.
Oh, cool!
And I was like, I'll get one of those. Sure.
You can actually do it with You can do it with coins as well.
Yeah,
that's the other thing to know. And that was this lovely little book that I have describes all the different ways you can actually do it with various different objects if you don't have I Ching wands to cast.
Yeah, and it's a great use of sort of an occult device for time travel. It's like a new thing they introduce, and it becomes a recurring trope too, where they'll use the I Ching for different things or to try to send their spirit back to in time.
Right. Once they've done it. Now Barnabas did a brief spirit hop back in time at the end of the second redux of the Vicky thing, right?
Yes.
So it's not completely unprecedented that he could send his spirit back in time. But honestly, I think it really works better this time in terms of the storytelling, because they've kind of anchored it.
Agreed.
And I don't know, did you ever read the Western Comics Dark Shadows series?
The Gold Key,
The Gold Key.
I have the Hermes Press puts out. I mean, I have a lot of the original issues, but I also got the collections that Hermes Press
and in that they never kind of really watched the show a lot, but they picked up certain things. One of the things that they picked up was that Barnabas could send his soul into the past.
Yes,
so that ended up. It doesn't happen that often in the show, but it happened like every other issue.
Totally. Yeah, they did that a lot.
Comics.
The Gold Key comics did a lot of crazy things for sure. Yeah, that definitely that became a recurring go-to for them. As a kid,
that always they disappointed me. But rereading them now as an adult, I can, they're not Dark Shadows really, in any meaningful way, but they're an interesting take on Dark Shadows.
Yeah,
by people that didn't really know the series, but are still trying hard.
Sure. I don't think any of the sort of spin-off media for Dark Shadows ever really fully captured it. The Gold Key and the novel, the Ross novels too. It's just, they think they're their own, I consider all of those things their own kind of parallel time, like they exist in their own parallel universe. Anyway, okay, wrapping this up, closing thoughts on this storyline, Stephen.
I think this is just fortuitously for when I started viewing. I think this is a great place to start viewing the series, because it starts by writing out the old Adam storyline and really propels you forward into what we both talked about as probably being one of the best portions of the series, one of the best storylines, the great era of Dark Shadows. And one of the great things about coming in here when I did was it then, if I went back to the beginning of Dark Shadows, or even to the Barnabas storyline, which is a little shaky in places at the start, I was willing to forgive that, because Dark Shadows had hooked me with this one.
Yeah.
And the writing and the characters and all aspects of the production, I think, were as strong as they could get here. And so I think this is actually a great place for people to start and pick up the storyline. And you need some of this to get into the 1897 storyline, which is what Dark Shadows is all about in some sense. It's really, that's when it was an even bigger hit. That's when we got the long playing album, which I played to death as a kid. And it's a great place to start. And it's one of the best storylines that they ever did. And this is the prelude to it, I guess, is what I want to say. Start, if you're a real purist, start at the beginning. If you just love vampires, start with Barnabas. But if you want to start when Dark Shadows was at its peak, this is the prelude era that leads you into that. And you can see as it escalates here, as we get the old storylines with Victoria Winters and the old Adam storylines, as those fall away interspiced with the start of this storyline, you get to start into the full power of Dark Shadows at this point. And I think it's a great place to start.
Awesome. I agree. I think it is a great place to start as well. And if you love ghosts and werewolves, this is the storyline for you for sure, because that's what you're going to get in this storyline. Stephen, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about Dark Shadows and your love of all things spooky, and your background in role playing and in writing. And where can fans find out more about your projects? Because you're always working on many things. You're very prolific. So where can fans find out what you're working on now?
Well, the easiest place is my website, which is StephenDSullivan.com, and that's spelled with a PH, like Stephen Strange, Dr. Strange, not the V as in Steven Spielberg, PH Stephen King, Stephen Strange, me. Stephen D. Sullivan, or you can abbreviate that to SDSullivan.com. It'll take you to the same place. You can find me on Facebook under my own name. And I will accept fan requests if you say, hey, I like your books, or hey, I want to talk to you about Dark Shadows or whatever. So you can find me there too. You can hear Atomic Tales, which is my 1950s giant bugs and UFO story, every month on the Memiverse audio podcast from StEuphoria.com, their monthly audio cast. There's a new episode of that every month, and we're up to episode 11 this month, and that is also on my site. You can find that on my main site, or go to atomictales.com and we'll hook you up there. Plus, almost every book I have ever written has a URL attached to it. So if you go to CushingHorrors.com, you can find Dr. Cushing. If you look in Patreon, want to throw me a buck or two a month to support this stuff, I'm there too. I'm all over the web, so shouldn't be too hard to find. Or you can ask Penny Dreadful, Danielle here.
I will definitely send anybody who asks your way for sure. Please check out Stephen's work. He is immensely talented, and you will not be disappointed. Thank you again, Stephen, for joining me. Right.
So we're doing this again tomorrow, right?
Yes, and the day after.
And for as long as they lived, the dark shadows never truly dissipated, for there will always be terror at Collinwood. Terror at Collinwood is a Penny Dreadful production.